Victor Holloway stood in front of the mirror, staring at the stranger he had become. The perfectly tailored suits, the imposing presence, the aura of power, all of it had been stripped away. In their place stood an ordinary man with roughened hands, cheap work clothes, and a name that wasn't his, Eric Dawson. He adjusted the blue-collar uniform and took a deep breath. The transformation had to be flawless. No one could suspect that the new warehouse worker at Holloway Industries was, in fact, its ruthless billionaire CEO. This wasn't just an exercise in corporate humility, this was about survival. 3 weeks ago, Victor received an anonymous letter detailing corruption, theft, and even human trafficking within his own company. At first, he dismissed it as paranoia. But then, one of his internal auditors, who had been investigating embezzlement, went missing. And when his personal assistant dug deeper, she was found dead in what was ruled a car accident. Someone inside Holloway Industries was covering their tracks, violently. And Victor needed to find out who before he became the next target. On his first day as Eric Dawson, Victor arrived at the Holloway Industries Distribution Center, a vast, sterile complex on the city's outskirts. His heart pounded as he walked through the security checkpoint, an experience he never had to endure before. His usual VIP access card was useless now. A burly guard barely glanced at his forged documents before waving him through. Victor took in the sight of workers moving frantically, forklifts beeping, and supervisors barking orders. He had built this empire, but now he was seeing it from the ground level for the first time. "Dawson! Over here!" a gruff voice called. Victor turned to see Frank Delgado, the warehouse manager, a thick-set man with a permanent scowl. Frank shoved a clipboard into his hands. "You're on loading dock duty. No screw-ups." "Yes, sir," Victor muttered, keeping his head down. It wasn't just about blending in. He needed to listen. Over the next few days, Victor began to notice things that didn't add up. Shipments were disappearing. Employees whispered about entire truckloads of merchandise going off the books, and certain workers seemed to carry an unusual amount of fear in their eyes. One evening, he overheard a hushed conversation near the storage racks. "You sure the boss doesn't suspect anything?" one worker asked nervously. "Relax. As long as we get the goods moved by tonight, we're fine," another replied. Victor's pulse quickened. The goods? What was being moved, and where was it going? Before he could listen further, a hand clamped onto his shoulder. "Eavesdropping, rookie?" He turned to find himself face to face with Darren Cole, the floor supervisor. Cole was lean, sharp-eyed, and exuded the kind of menace that came from knowing you held power over people. Victor played dumb. "Just catching my breath. Long shift." Cole studied him for a moment before giving a smirk. "Yeah? Well, you better keep your head down. Some questions get answered with a broken jaw around here." Victor nodded and walked away, but his mind was racing. Whatever was happening inside his company was bigger than he had imagined. Determined to gather evidence, Victor stayed late that night, watching from the shadows as several workers loaded unmarked crates into the back of a black truck. When one of them pried open a crate, Victor caught a glimpse of what was inside: firearms. Military grade. His blood turned cold. Holloway Industries was moving illegal weapons. Before he could react, he felt the barrel of a gun press against his spine. A low voice growled behind him. "You shouldn't have seen that." Ethan sat in his hotel room, staring at the folder filled with information about Titan Tech. He had spent a week as Evan Carter, the quiet new hire in the logistics department. What he had seen so far was troubling: missing inventory, unfulfilled orders, and employees working in constant fear of management. The deeper he dug, the more he realized that something far worse was at play. It wasn't just inefficiency, it was deliberate sabotage. Someone inside the company was orchestrating delays and losses. If Titan Tech continued down this path, bankruptcy would be inevitable within a year. He had to find out who was behind it. The following morning, Ethan returned to the warehouse. This time, he kept an eye on the night shift reports. Titan Tech was known for its top-tier security, yet there were discrepancies. Pallets of high-value components were marked as delivered but never logged in the inventory system. Employees in charge of verifying shipments claimed the records were altered after their shifts ended. Ethan's instincts told him this wasn't just negligence, it was a cover-up. Determined to uncover the truth, Ethan befriended Mia, a seasoned supervisor who had been with the company for over a decade. She had noticed the same anomalies but was afraid to speak up. "If you dig too deep, you disappear," she whispered, glancing around nervously. 2 people who raised concerns were suddenly transferred out of state. No explanations. Just gone. Ethan's stomach tightened. This wasn't just internal corruption, it was intimidation. Later that night, as Ethan reviewed the day's findings in his room, his phone buzzed with an unknown number. "Stop asking questions, Mr. Carter," a distorted voice warned. "You don't belong here." Before he could respond, the line went dead. A cold chill ran down his spine. His cover was slipping. Someone knew he wasn't just another worker. Ethan knew he had 2 options: walk away and let Titan Tech collapse, or push forward and expose the truth, no matter the risk. His decision was made. The next morning, he returned to work, acting as if nothing had happened. If someone suspected him, he had to make them believe he was just a regular worker, oblivious to the company's deeper secrets. He devised a plan to infiltrate the restricted access storage. If the missing shipments were truly being diverted, that's where the evidence would be. But before he could make his move, Mia pulled him aside. "Don't come back here tomorrow," she pleaded. "They know." Ethan stared at her, realization dawning. He wasn't just investigating corruption, he was now a target. And he was running out of time. Ethan stood in his dimly lit office, staring at the concealed recording device he had retrieved from under his desk. His mind raced. Someone was watching him. But who? And more importantly, why? He had barely settled back into his routine as a disguised employee at Titan Corp when the unease set in. His initial encounters with the workers had been revealing, but now, there was an added layer of tension. Someone in the company had noticed him, someone who didn't like his presence. Determined to uncover more, Ethan decided to get closer to some of the employees who had caught his attention. One in particular, a woman named Claire Dawson, had piqued his interest. She was sharp, efficient, and had an uncanny way of predicting management decisions before they happened. If there was anyone who knew the inner workings of Titan Corp, it was her. The next morning, Ethan approached Claire during their break. She was sipping a cup of black coffee, scrolling through her phone. "Mind if I join you?" he asked casually. She glanced up, her eyes assessing him before nodding. "Sure, newbie. What's up?" Ethan took a seat. "I've been hearing some rumors about management playing favorites, projects getting delayed for odd reasons. Figured you might know more." Claire raised an eyebrow. "That's a bold assumption. Why do you care?" Ethan shrugged. "Just curious. I like to know the lay of the land." She smirked. "Curiosity gets people into trouble around here." Ethan leaned in slightly. "Is that a warning?" Claire studied him for a moment, then sighed. "Look, I don't know what you're after, but if you really want to know what's going on, you should be asking about Oliver Trent." Ethan's pulse quickened. Oliver Trent was one of the senior executives at Titan Corp, a man known for his aggressive business tactics. "What about him?" Claire hesitated, then lowered her voice. "People say he's involved in something shady. Money disappearing, projects being delayed for strategic reasons, only for them to reappear under a different department with a different budget. If you're asking questions, be careful. Trent doesn't like people poking around." Ethan nodded, absorbing her words. Trent had been on his radar before, but now, he had a direct lead. That night, Ethan decided to take a risk. He accessed the company's internal network using the credentials of his undercover persona, looking for financial irregularities. As he combed through transactions, he found discrepancies, funds being transferred to shell companies, invoices for services that didn't exist. Before he could dig deeper, his screen flickered. A single message appeared. "Stop digging. Ethan's heart pounded. Someone was onto him. The game had just changed. James Sterling sat in his dimly lit hotel room, staring at the wall with a deep frown. The events of the past few days weighed heavily on him. His time at Sterling Logistics as an undercover employee had revealed harsh truths, corrupt managers, mistreated workers, and a company culture that had strayed far from his original vision. He had built this empire from the ground up, and now, watching it crumble under mismanagement, he knew he had to take decisive action. But he had to be careful. His cover wasn't entirely blown, but he could sense that someone was getting suspicious. The way Greg Thompson, the warehouse manager, had eyed him earlier that day sent a shiver down his spine. The man had power, and James suspected he had been running illegal operations under the company's nose. If James exposed him too soon, Greg might retaliate, making the situation even more dangerous. The next morning, James walked into the warehouse, greeted by the usual chaos. Workers rushed back and forth, shouting over the sounds of machinery and conveyor belts. He spotted Maria, the single mother who had shown him kindness despite her own struggles. She gave him a small nod as she passed by, her face weary but determined. He had gained the trust of several employees, but he needed solid evidence before making his move. Taking a deep breath, he approached the restricted storage area Greg had warned him to stay away from. James knew he was taking a risk, but he had to see what was being hidden in there. Just as he reached for the latch, a voice cut through the noise. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" James turned to find Greg standing behind him, arms crossed, his expression a mix of anger and suspicion. "You don't belong here, kid." Thinking fast, James forced a nervous chuckle. "I got lost. First week, you know? This place is a maze." Greg didn't look convinced, but he simply scoffed and grabbed James by the shoulder, steering him away. "Stay out of places you don't belong, and you won't have any problems. Got it?" James nodded, but inside, he knew he was running out of time. He needed proof, and he needed it fast. That night, he met with Maria and two other workers, Evan and Lisa, at a small diner near the warehouse. They were hesitant, whispering their concerns while keeping an eye on the door. Lisa, the youngest among them, leaned forward. "If Greg finds out we're talking, we're done." James lowered his voice. "I need to know everything. What exactly is going on in that warehouse?" Evan glanced around before sighing. "We think Greg is smuggling goods, high-end electronics, even pharmaceuticals. Some of us have seen shipments coming in that never go out on the company records." James clenched his jaw. This was worse than he had imagined. His company, his reputation, everything was at risk. Maria placed a hand on his. "We want to help, but we can't do it alone. If Greg suspects anything, he'll make our lives hell." James nodded. "I have a plan. But first we need proof." The next phase of his undercover mission had begun. And this time, he wasn't just fighting for his company. He was fighting for the people who had been wronged. The morning after the confrontation with Stephen, Daniel sat in his cramped apartment, staring at the documents sprawled across his kitchen table. The evidence he had gathered so far painted a picture of corruption so deep it sickened him. He had spent the night sifting through old financial records, employee complaints, and security footage. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. Stephen Holt was running a side operation, siphoning funds from the company and exploiting his workers for personal gain. The revelation left Daniel with two clear options: either expose Stephen now or gather more irrefutable evidence. His gut told him to wait, to dig deeper, but time was against him. The deeper he went, the more dangerous it became. Back at the warehouse, tension hung in the air. The workers sensed something was off. Stephen had been unusually aggressive, barking orders and scrutinizing every detail. It was clear he suspected something, and Daniel knew he had to be careful. As the shift went on, Daniel noticed an unusual movement near the restricted storage area. Two of Stephen's closest men, Travis and Leo, were moving crates under the cover of darkness. Daniel had never been allowed near that section, but tonight he took the risk. Feigning a need for extra supplies, he made his way toward the back of the warehouse. The moment he stepped inside, he saw what they were hiding: luxury merchandise, electronics, and even pharmaceuticals. Stolen goods. This wasn't just about underpaid workers or missing money. Steven was running a full-scale smuggling operation through the company's supply chain. His heart pounded. This was the proof he needed. But before he could snap a picture, a heavy hand clamped down on his shoulder. Daniel turned to find himself face to face with Leo, his muscular frame blocking the exit. "What the hell do you think you're doing here?" Leo growled. Thinking fast, Daniel played dumb. "Just looking for some extra inventory. Boss told me to check back here." Leo's eyes narrowed, studying him for a moment. Then, without warning, he grabbed Daniel by the collar and shoved him against a stack of crates. "I don't buy it," he hissed. "You've been poking around where you don't belong." Before Daniel could react, Travis appeared, his face twisted in amusement. "Steven's gonna want to talk to him." Daniel's mind raced. If they took him to Steven now, he'd be exposed. He had to act fast. With a surge of adrenaline, he twisted out of Leo's grip and shoved him backward, sending him crashing into the crates. The distraction gave him just enough time to make a run for it. He dashed through the warehouse, heart hammering in his chest. He could hear their footsteps pounding behind him, but he knew the layout better now. Diving behind a stack of pallets, he held his breath as they ran past. The moment they were gone, he bolted for the exit and disappeared into the night. Back in his apartment, Daniel knew he was out of time. Steven would know by morning that he was the one snooping around. He needed to go to someone who could help: Lillian Carter, the company's CFO. She was one of the few executives who seemed to have a conscience. Dialing her number, he took a deep breath. "Lillian, it's Daniel. We need to talk. Now." There was silence on the other end, then a cautious, "What's this about?" "I have proof that Steven's running an illegal operation through the company," he said. "I need your help before he takes me out of the picture." Another pause. Then, finally, "Meet me at my office. 30 minutes. Hanging up, Daniel grabbed his evidence and ran out the door, unaware that a pair of headlights had just flicked on outside his building, following his every move. Ethan sat alone in his dimly lit office, staring at the classified documents spread across his desk. The deeper he dug, the more he realized that Green Tech's corruption ran deeper than he had ever imagined. His heart pounded as he connected the dots: embezzlement, bribery, and now even potential ties to organized crime. He had worked undercover for months, but now, the real danger was just beginning. As he leaned back in his chair, his phone buzzed. A message from Sophie. "Sophie, we need to talk. Urgent. Meet me at the usual place in an hour." Ethan's stomach twisted. Sophie had been his closest ally in this operation, but something about this message felt off. Nevertheless, he grabbed his coat and left the office, heading toward the old dockyard where they usually met in secret. When he arrived, Sophie was already there, pacing nervously. Her hands trembled as she clutched a folder against her chest. The moment she saw him, she exhaled sharply, as if relieved yet terrified at the same time. "You came," she murmured. "What's wrong?" Ethan asked, his instincts on high alert. Sophie hesitated before handing him the folder. "I found something bad." Ethan flipped through the pages. Photos, bank transactions, internal memos. It was all damning evidence, proving that Green Tech's CEO, Raymond Holt, had been laundering money through offshore accounts. "This is huge," Ethan whispered. "This could bring him down." "That's what I thought," Sophie said, her voice unsteady. "But then I found something else." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small flash drive. This was hidden in Holt's private server. I had to bypass 3 layers of encryption just to access it. "And Ethan, your name is on it." Ethan's blood ran cold. "What?" Sophie swallowed hard. "It looks like Holt knows about you. Someone inside the company must have tipped him off." Ethan clenched his jaw, his mind racing. If Holt knew who he was, then his cover was blown. Worse, it meant he was now a target. We have to move fast. Sophie continued. I've arranged a meeting with our FBI contact. But Ethan, there's something else. What? Sophie hesitated again, looking down before meeting his gaze. I think there's a mole in our team. The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. If there was a mole, that meant every step they took was being watched. Every move they made had been anticipated. Do you have any leads? Ethan asked, his voice low and sharp. Sophie nodded. I don't have proof yet, but I have a strong suspicion. Ethan took a deep breath, steadying himself. Then we need to be careful. We can't trust anyone. As they turned to leave, a loud noise shattered the silence. A gunshot. Then another. Sophie gasped as a bullet whizzed past them, shattering the wooden crate behind them. Run! Ethan shouted, grabbing Sophie's arm and pulling her behind cover. More gunshots rang out. They were under attack. Ethan drew his concealed weapon, peeking out from behind the crate. Shadows moved between the docked cargo containers, multiple attackers. This wasn't a warning. This was an execution attempt. He fired back, forcing the attackers to take cover, then turned to Sophie. We need to get out of here. Now. Sophie nodded, fear flashing in her eyes. They darted between the shipping containers, dodging bullets as they made their way toward Ethan's car. He could hear footsteps closing in behind them. Just as they reached the car, a figure stepped into their path, a man in a dark suit, his gun aimed directly at Ethan's chest. Game over. The man sneered. Ethan barely had time to react before another gunshot echoed through the air. The man's eyes widened in shock as he staggered backward, blood staining his shirt. He collapsed onto the pavement, revealing the figure standing behind him. It was Logan, Ethan's former friend and mentor, holding a smoking gun. I told you to be careful, Logan muttered. Now let's go before more of them show up. Ethan locked eyes with him, a million questions racing through his mind. But now wasn't the time. Without another word, they got into the car and sped away into the night, the weight of betrayal heavy in the air. Ethan sat in his dimly lit office, the weight of his discoveries pressing heavily on his shoulders. He had uncovered a tangled web of deceit within the company, but the mastermind behind it remained elusive. The recent attempt on his life had made one thing clear: he was dangerously close to the truth. Determined to push forward, Ethan called an emergency meeting with his closest allies, Sarah, the whistleblower who had first tipped him off, Daniel, his most trusted advisor, and Lisa, the loyal executive who had been by his side through thick and thin. We need to act fast. Ethan began, his voice low but firm. Someone within this company wants to ensure the truth never comes to light. Daniel nodded gravely. After analyzing the latest financial reports, I found discrepancies that lead directly to offshore accounts. Someone has been siphoning funds for years. Lisa leaned forward. And I've been looking into employee records. Several key personnel left abruptly before the scandal began. Some of them are connected to rivals. This wasn't just embezzlement, it was a takeover from within. Sarah, who had been silent, finally spoke. I think I know who might be behind this. But it's risky. We need solid proof before we move. Ethan took a deep breath. Then let's get that proof. No matter what it takes. With the team assembled, Ethan decided to set a trap. They needed to draw out the traitor. Whoever was orchestrating the fraud had to be caught in the act. Using false financial projections, they leaked information about a lucrative upcoming deal, something too tempting for the saboteur to ignore. Lisa arranged for an anonymous tip to be sent to a suspected middleman, hinting at an internal whistleblower preparing to go public. If their target took the bait, they would have confirmation. That night, Ethan watched the security feeds closely, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Hours passed without movement. Then, at precisely 2:17 a.m., a shadowy figure entered the restricted archives. There you are, Ethan murmured. Ethan, accompanied by Daniel and security, burst into the room. The intruder froze, caught red-handed. As the lights flickered on, Ethan's breath caught in his throat. No. It can't be you. Standing in the middle of the archive room, clutching confidential documents, was Lisa. A bitter smile curled on her lips. I was hoping you wouldn't be so persistent, Ethan. But here we are. You. Daniel's voice was filled with disbelief. After everything? Lisa's gaze was unreadable. Do you really think this company was built on honesty? The corruption runs deeper than you realize. I was just ensuring I ended up on the winning side. Ethan clenched his fists. You betrayed everything we stood for. No, Ethan. I just did what was necessary to survive. As security restrained Lisa, Ethan felt a mix of anger and sorrow. One of his most trusted allies had been his enemy all along. Take her to the authorities, he ordered, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. With Lisa's arrest, the web of corruption within the company began to unravel. More names surfaced, more arrests followed. But even as the company began to heal, Ethan knew the battle wasn't over. There's always another threat lurking in the shadows. Sarah warned as they stood in his office, watching the sunrise. But at least for now, we have a fighting chance. Ethan nodded. And we'll be ready for whatever comes next. Michael sat in his penthouse suite, staring at the walls as he tried to make sense of everything. His double life as an undercover boss had brought him into direct confrontation with the darkest side of his company. What started as an experiment in humility had turned into a battle for survival. The evidence he had gathered against Richard Hale, his own trusted executive, was damning. Money laundering, bribery, labor exploitation, crimes that could destroy the company's reputation and put its employees in serious jeopardy. As he poured himself a drink, his phone vibrated. It was a message from an unknown number. You're playing a dangerous game, Michael. You don't want to make enemies out of the wrong people. A chill ran down his spine. Whoever had sent the message knew exactly what he was up to. He couldn't go to the police without airtight proof, but if he waited too long, Richard might cover his tracks. He had to act fast. The only person he could trust now was Jenna Carter, the investigative journalist he had reached out to. They met in an inconspicuous diner on the city's outskirts, away from prying eyes. Jenna, a fiery reporter known for taking down corrupt corporate giants, had agreed to meet him under the condition that he provide her with substantial proof. Michael slid a USB drive across the table. This has everything. Wire transfers, off-the-book transactions, employee testimonies. Jenna picked it up, examining it carefully. If this is real, you're sitting on a ticking time bomb. Richard Hale won't just let this slide. I know, Michael admitted. Which is why I need your help. I need to get this information out before he buries it. Or me. Jenna nodded. I'll verify everything and release the findings, but you should be ready for retaliation. As they parted ways, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Returning to his office the next day, Michael tried to act normal, pretending to be oblivious to Richard's illicit dealings. But Richard was already suspicious. As Michael entered his office, he found Richard sitting in his chair, calmly swirling a glass of whiskey. You've been busy, Richard said smoothly, his sharp eyes locked onto Michael's. Visiting warehouses, talking to workers, meeting with reporters. Care to explain what you're up to? Michael kept his composure. Just making sure the company runs smoothly. I've been hearing some concerning things. Richard smirked. If you have concerns, you bring them to me. You don't sneak around like a rat. Michael knew he had to tread carefully. I only want what's best for this company. If there are issues, they need to be addressed. Richard leaned forward, his expression darkening. Be very careful, Michael. You might not like what you find. That night, Michael's penthouse was broken into. He arrived just in time to see masked men rifling through his belongings. He barely managed to escape, calling Jenna as he ran down the fire escape. They know, he gasped. Richard knows everything. We need to release the story now. Jenna's voice was tense. I already started. But Michael, I think I was followed. His blood ran cold. They were both targets now. The game had escalated, and there was no turning back. Nathan Carter sat in the dimly lit safe house, a cold sweat running down his back. He had come too far to fail now. The truth about Dominion Industries, its criminal empire, and James Harrington's ruthless ambition was within his grasp. The files retrieved from the offshore server revealed a horrifying network of corruption, money laundering, and even ordered assassinations. But he needed one final piece, a direct confession from Harrington himself. With every step, the game had become more dangerous. Emma, who had infiltrated Dominion's security team, reported increased surveillance. They knew someone was close to exposing them. Adrian, their tech specialist, had barely managed to evade a cyber trap meant to track their movements. And Logan, the only contact inside Dominion still willing to help, was missing. Nathan's phone buzzed, a secure message from Emma. Harrington scheduled a meeting with the board tomorrow. He's bringing the ledger. The ledger. The final proof. Nathan clenched his fists. This was their last chance. The plan was simple, yet deadly. Emma would use her access to disable key security feeds while Adrian created a digital ghost of Nathan to mislead Dominion's trackers. Nathan himself would infiltrate the meeting disguised as an emergency consultant, his final undercover role. As Nathan adjusted his disguise, Emma placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. This is it. We either take him down or we disappear forever. Nathan nodded. Let's finish this. Under the cover of a fire alarm distraction orchestrated by Adrian, Nathan walked into the restricted conference room just as Harrington was about to present the ledger. The room fell silent. Harrington's eyes narrowed. Who the hell are you? Nathan smirked. Someone who's about to end your empire. Before Harrington could react, Logan, battered but alive, burst through the doors, gun in hand. It's over, Harrington. The authorities are on their way. Chaos erupted. Harrington's security drew weapons, but Emma and Adrian had already triggered a lockdown, trapping them inside. Nathan seized the moment, grabbing the ledger and tossing it to Logan. Harrington lunged at Nathan, fury in his eyes. You think this will stop me? I built this empire with my blood. Nathan dodged, landing a punch that sent Harrington sprawling. And you'll lose it in a prison cell. Sirens wailed in the distance. Dominion's reign was about to crumble. As the authorities swarmed Dominion's headquarters, Nathan, Emma, Logan, and Adrian watched from a distance. It was finally over. Harrington was arrested, the truth exposed, and Dominion's grip shattered. Nathan exhaled. He had gone undercover to expose a corrupt corporation but had uncovered something deeper, a purpose. As dawn broke, he turned to his team. What's next? Emma asked. Nathan smirked. There's always another case. But first, they would savor this victory. One battle won, but the war against corruption had only just begun. James Carter sat in the executive boardroom of Carter Enterprises, facing the very people who had once praised him, then sought to betray him. The weeks spent undercover had revealed more than he had ever imagined: corruption, embezzlement, and a complete disregard for the very workers who built the company. Now, it was time for justice. Seated across from him were his father, Richard Carter, and the company's top executives, including William Tate, the CFO, and Veronica Hastings, the head of human resources. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with anticipation and unspoken accusations. James leaned forward, clasping his hands together. I suppose you're all wondering why I called this meeting. Richard gave his son a measured look. James, if this is about your little experiment, I hope you understand that certain things are best left unseen. James chuckled, shaking his head. Oh, I saw plenty, Father. Enough to realize that this company is rotting from the inside. Embezzlement, mistreatment of employees, forged contracts. Shall I go on? William Tate shifted uncomfortably in his seat. These are serious accusations, James. If you have proof, I suggest you present it. James smirked and slid a thick folder across the table. Inside this folder is everything I've gathered: recordings, financial records, witness statements. It all points to a system of corruption orchestrated at the highest levels of this company. And at the center of it all? You, William. William's face paled. That's absurd. I've done nothing but ensure this company remains profitable. By siphoning funds into offshore accounts? By cutting salaries while inflating your own bonuses? James pressed. You nearly destroyed what my grandfather built. But the worst part? You weren't alone. He turned to Veronica. You systematically silenced complaints, covered up unethical layoffs, and manipulated performance reviews to push out employees who stood against you. Veronica scoffed. This is ridiculous. Do you think your little charade as an undercover worker is enough to dismantle us? James smiled coldly. Oh, I think it's more than enough. Because while I was playing the role of an average employee, I made friends, good people who wanted to see this company thrive. People like Marcus, the warehouse supervisor, or Lisa, the accountant who discovered your financial discrepancies. They weren't just willing to talk. They were willing to testify. A heavy silence settled over the room. Richard Carter exhaled slowly. James, what do you plan to do with this information? James straightened. I've already contacted the authorities. By now, they should be receiving everything they need to launch a full investigation. I expect you, William and Veronica, to step down immediately. And as for you, Father... He paused, searching his father's face for any sign of remorse. You'll have to decide where your loyalties lie. Richard's expression remained unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, regret, perhaps. You've always been bold, James. I just never expected you to turn that boldness against your own family. James sighed. It's not about family, Father. It's about doing what's right. This company deserves better. The people who work here deserve better. And I won't let greed and corruption take it away from them. Richard looked around the room, then slowly nodded. Then I suppose this is your company now. Do what you must. The meeting ended with William and Veronica being escorted out by security. As James stood in the now emptied boardroom, he felt the weight of the moment settle over him. He had fought for the company he loved, exposed the rot, and was now in a position to rebuild it. It wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in a long while, Carter Enterprises had a future worth believing in. And James Carter was ready to lead it.